Rob, let's start with you.
Great.
Please tell us about yourself.
Well, thanks for having me in, first of all, David, and thanks for getting COOV.com off the ground and providing this service to the people of Clark County. I've been Attorney General now for 6.5 years. And before that, served a couple of terms on the King County Council, and was in private practice with a major law firm in the Seattle area prior to that. Grew up in the Army and moved all over the world, spent more of my life overseas than in the States until I was in high school. And now my wife Marilyn and I are raising our 4 children up in Bellevue. We chose not to move to Olympia, but to stay in our home and keep our kids in our schools. And we've had a great experience. We've decided to explore a new opportunity, and that is to seek the governorship of Washington State. And in that race, we'll be talking about a lot of issues, including some of the issues that will come up in our conversation today. But the 3 top issues, the 3 that we'll spend the most time discussing, are job creation to turn around the sky-high unemployment rate that we see in Washington State, estimated at 16 to 19% when you fully calculate it. We'll be talking about education reform, because we're considered an education reform backwater from a national perspective. Louisiana and New York City are miles ahead of us now in reforming their education systems. We need to catch up. And third, we'll be talking about reforming state government, making it more cost-effective, more productive, more transparent, more accountable to the people of the state.
Transparency and accountability, reforming state government. You're hitting some strings that are passionate, I believe, to our community. Can you elaborate a little bit more about how does a governor bring accountability and reform to state government?
First of all, by assuring that there's transparency in government, that information, documents, financial information is available to the public when they ask for it. This has been a priority for me in all of my years as Attorney General. In fact, I created an Office of Government Accountability within the Attorney General's office. It's led by an Assistant Attorney General who is the ombudsman for the entire state on open public records issues, whether those public records issues or public meetings issues are in with state agencies or with local governments. We wrote a set of rules that are now codified in the Washington Administrative Code that explain how the Public Records Act work and how agencies are supposed to comply with it. We've successfully mediated hundreds of disputes between citizen requesters and government agencies over public records access. We work regularly with the media to make sure they have access to government information. We've also offered a number of bills to the legislature that have strengthened public records access. So I'm very committed to this. And my predecessor, who's now our governor, took a tack that was not quite the same. She actually argued in the Supreme Court that there should be less access to public records in a case called Hangartner, which was a challenge to sound transit up in the Central Puget Sound area, and a challenge to the Seattle Monorail project, now defunct. When they refused to provide records that had been requested of them, she took the position that the agencies were right and the requesters were wrong. I came in and actually offered a bill that undid a lot of the damage from that Supreme Court decision to restore accessibility and the availability of records. So you can expect to see that kind of contrast when I become governor as well.
Tiffany, you may have some questions along those lines, since your job is to bring things to light.
I guess maybe give an example of public requests that had been denied, or what is your definition of transparency and accountability?
Right.
Maybe you can translate that into an example of
you bet.
Something you guys mediated.
I'll give you a couple of examples. Number one, in the Hangartner case, the Seattle Monorail and Sound Transit refused to provide records that had been requested to them because they said some of them were protected by attorney-client privilege, and they included their lawyers, and it seemed like, to outsiders, it seemed like they included their lawyers whenever they could in order to cite the attorney-client privilege. I think that's an abuse of the lawyers, for one thing, certainly of the privilege. They also claimed that the Monorail claimed that because one request was for all of their records, it was too broad, when in fact they could have provided those records on compact discs and made them available, emails or financial records or meeting minutes or what have you. So we fought successfully in the legislature to overturn the Supreme Court's ruling that a request which is too broad can be rejected, because that puts the requester, the citizen, in the position of having to guess how many of the records they're allowed to ask for before it's considered too broad. So we got that reversed. Another example I'll give you is from my personal experience as a member of the board of Sound Transit. I was on that board. I was an acknowledged light rail skeptic, not because there's anything wrong with the technology. I've used light rail in cities like San Diego, and I thought it worked pretty well. But they were building their light rail line for $45 million a mile. Seattle's building it for $200 to $400 million per mile. And I came in and said, look, we want to invest in transit, but wouldn't it make more sense to invest in buses and in bus rapid transit to get the service up and running much, much faster? We have people today standing on buses leaving downtown Seattle to go back to the east side or to South King County because they've taken bus service away. The very capital-intensive rail project has sucked up so many resources there isn't enough bus service. So I was an acknowledged skeptic of the light rail plan. But as a board member, I felt it was my duty to try to execute the plan the voters had approved, and I did my level best to bring that plan to reality. As I served on the board, however, I began closely reviewing the financial statements of the agency and the financial plans and questioning staff, and I became more and more suspicious that something wasn't right. In August of 1999, I was told I could not have access to bids that had been returned by a couple of major contractors for the tunnels under Capitol Hill, where the light rail line will connect from downtown Seattle to the University of Washington. They said, no, we're not going to let board members see those bids. That really alarmed me. Because
what position did you hold during that time? Were you
I was a member of the King County Council, and in that position had been appointed to the board of Sound Transit.
And was the story that the bids held sort of intellectual property, and so they didn't want to share the bidding?
Yeah. Basically, they said that these are confidential, and we're not even going to share them with board members, much less the public. And here I am, a fiduciary, charged with responsibility for seeing this plan through. Ultimately, I raised an alarm to the federal government, which is one of the big funders, and the Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Transportation came in, and I showed her from how you piece together parts of the financial reporting from the agency to get the real picture. And she realized when I laid it all out for her that she had been lied to by agency management. Ultimately, the executive director lost his job. What he was doing was systematically raiding reserve accounts and contingency fund accounts to shift money on paper over to make up for huge cost overruns. The reason they didn't want the board members to see the bids on the tunnel is they came in way over the budget. Basically, it came down to this. They promised the voters they would build a light rail line from SeaTac Airport to the University of Washington for $2.4 billion. And they didn't come even close to doing that. In fact, they ultimately had to pull the plug on that plan, go back to the voters and get the voters to approve a new plan, which for about the same amount of money brought the light rail from SeaTac to downtown Seattle, but not to Capitol Hill, that dense area, and not to the UW. And that was very, very sobering to think that agency staff would try to hide the ball from board members, not disclose what they were doing in terms of cooking the books to make it look like they could still afford to build this plan.
So if board members are not able to look at the books, if you're not able to gain access to the information, everyone else assumes that the board members know everything that's going on.
Precisely.
That you're informed because there's responsibility there.
Right, and ironically, the chairman of the Sound Transit Board Finance Committee was Greg Nichols, who went on to become mayor of Seattle. He didn't know what was going on, but he wasn't asking the questions. I asked the questions, a couple of other board members started asking the same questions, and together we exposed what was happening. The moral of the story is transparency is extremely important. These projects are very large, they're prone to overruns. That's going to happen on these projects. They ought to be honest about it. They ought to be very forthright about how they're spending the money, where they're spending the money, whether they're on budget or not, whether they're on track to meet the timelines they promised the voters or not. Because what often happens with these big, complex projects, especially those that are voter approved, is that there's a great temptation to lowball the cost and to lowball the timeline to get the voters to approve the project and then turn around and say, oh, we're sorry, we couldn't do it that cheaply or that quickly after all.
So we understand that those are the desires. In fact, if you go to the powers that be that are spending that money, they'll tell you, oh yeah, it's all transparent, we believe in accountability. But in reality, Since that story unfolded,
Yes.
what is in place now, or what should be in place to ensure that there are consequences and that the information really is delivered?
With sound transit, you have a stronger oversight from the federal government. You have a more alert media that pays attention. I think you have board members who pay closer attention. I hope they do. The board's turned over since I was on it over 9 years ago. And I think they have better management now. I have respect for the current CEO of Sound Transit. She seems to be much more open and much more forthright about costs and what they can do and what they can't afford to do. So the culture of that agency has improved since the early days. But I think because of the political pressures that come to bear on staff and the temptation that exists to try to tell the board members what they want to hear and to keep those unrealistic promises to voters, you have to be very vigilant on any large public project to make sure that they don't fall prey to those temptations.
What if you don't have the culture? What if you have individuals that are there, they want to advance their agenda, and they really, their job at all costs is to get it pushed through, to get it done, and that they don't deliver? What are the consequences? What are the recourses for citizens or even forensic accountants to be able to get access to that information and hold the project or push the pause button if it's not delivered?
There are checks and balances in the system. I gave the example of the federal government coming in and the Inspector General for U.S. Department of Transportation conducting a thorough investigation. That was part of the checks and balances. So if there's federal funding in a project and you have evidence that something's not right, the disclosure is inadequate, or somehow the numbers are being manipulated, talking to an outside agency that has some piece of this project would be one route. Another would be, of course, to work with the elected officials who are supposed to be accountable to the voters and try to find at least a few who are willing to ask the tough questions. It's not comfortable. I can tell you it wasn't comfortable sitting there being the board member saying, you know what, this project doesn't work the way we were told it's going to work. They've been withholding information from us. But you have to have at least one elected official on the governing board with the courage to do that. Number three, the public can play an important role through public records requests, obtaining detailed information, going to the meetings and asking questions. One of the ways that we tried to keep Sound Transit honest was that we had transportation experts and engineering experts and others who had concerns. They're not anti-transit, just like the rest of us weren't anti-transit, but they are pro-taxpayer and pro-accountability. All of us want transit, but we want transit that doesn't bankrupt us and that's effective. So we had experts that would come in and look at various aspects of the plan and ask good, hard questions. The way that CUV.com and you, David, have been raising questions and requesting information, Tiffany's involvement in looking at information you've requested for a local project, that's an example of how you can start to obtain enough information to raise legitimate questions that then are hard to avoid. The big problem with keeping any big project accountable is not even knowing which questions to ask. Because everything appears fine from the outside. And so the work that you do to investigate becomes very important in finding the problems, or at least finding smoke, and then you can ask the questions to see if there's fire.
So your experience with the Sound Transit, it sounds like you've made some progress up there. Down here, we are running up against a brick wall, it seems. Tiffany does know the right questions to ask, but we are not receiving those answers. And the question is, what can we do? In fact, Tiffany, if you could take the lead here for a little bit and maybe list some of the specific experiences that you've had, what's wrong and what needs to be made right here, just to answer that accountability question.
I loved your comment, somebody to raise the questions, because I like to be an answers person and kind of tell the story of what's happened here in this situation. I do that with any client. And in this case, the best I've been able to do is just raise more questions, it seems, and have not been able to find a lot of answers yet. So, for example, some of the questions I ask as an accountant, and especially as a forensic accountant, wanting to first look at financial documents, or excuse me, financial statements, and then have the documents that support those numbers.
Absolutely.
I can't even start with a financial statement.
Why is that?
Because according to the CRC, they are a project. They are a project that they are shared between ODOT and WSDOT. And so they're supposed to manage the money from ODOT, WashDOT, and the feds to build this project, and they're also supposed to be responsible for the expenditures of the money.
Okay.
But they are not required to have a financial statement. So at least that's what they told us.